Why are these men loading cargo into the wings of this airplane? Where are the engines on this airplane? And what is going on here? Well, let's find out in Celebrating Aviation with Mike Machat. What all those airplanes had in common is they were aerial oddities. We're going to look at them. It's amazing when you consider aviation history. The Gloucester E-2839, Great Britain's first jet airplane in 1941. And then look at this, the beautiful Blackburn Buccaneer in 1958. At the time, they were considered aerial oddities. And yet it was less than 20 years to go from Britain's first jet to the first transonic airplane, this beautiful Buccaneer. Sometimes you just wonder why. What were they thinking? Putting a turboprop engine on a jet fighter, the Republic XF-84H Thunder Screech. Sometimes those airplanes flew, sometimes they never got off the drawing board. But let's take a look at some of the different types of aerial oddities. They all centered around a mission. For instance, the quest for vertical flight. The good news, VTOLs, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, didn't need runways. They were adaptable for shipboard use. The bad news, they were highly complex, very difficult to land. Let's take a look. This odd-looking contraption is a flight version of the Lockheed XF-V1 Salmon. Now, that's not a permanent landing gear, obviously not retractable, but it was a test rig because the airplane was only flown in horizontal flight, even though it was designed to take off and land vertically. Another problem is the amount of ground equipment needed just to get the pilot in the cockpit. But again, the Salmon never flew vertically. It was on this mobile launcher. This airplane did, however, the Convair Pogo. It took off vertically, transitioned to horizontal flight, and landed successfully. But it was just too complex, very high workload for the pilot. And so none of these airplanes ever reached production. The solution for a jet VTOL was in the form of the Ryan X-13, which was mounted on a truck bed. And this did fly well. It achieved speeds over 600 miles an hour. But again, in overall practicality, none of these airplanes ever reached full production. The French Coleopter was basically a jet engine with a cockpit on the front of it, and ultimately unsuccessful airplane. But these were all attempts, and the inevitable question, why would they build airplanes that look like this? Well, in the age before computer simulation and before the digital era, aviation was basically you build it, you fly it, you try it. If it works, you keep it. If it doesn't, you move on. The solution for vertical flight, of course, came with the Hawker Siddeley P-1127 Kestrel in 1960. This was the experimental predecessor to the Harrier. And today we have the Lockheed Martin X-35B. So takeoff and landing, well, okay, how about just takeoff? You don't need an airport if you have something like this. This is the ZEL concept, standing for Zero Length Launch. Here we have a North American F-100 Super Sabre. These experiments were also carried out with Lockheed F-104 starfighters, the idea being for NATO countries to have immediate mobility in forests or wherever they could truck these airplanes to with the giant JATO booster. And again, ultimately never used. But here's another one, taking the fighters with the bombers, fighter conveyance, the Parasite fighters, Project Tiptoe, and FICON. Let's take a look. Here we have the USS Macon, a dirigible in the early 1930s. And if you look carefully, you see those two little biplanes. Those were Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawks that attached to a trapeze. These pilots were called the men on the flying trapeze back in those days. And the idea is that the Zeppelin would carry its own fighter protection inside, and they would deploy these fighters to circle around and protect the airship. That concept carried forth into the jet age with the McDonnell XF-85 Goblin. This is an airplane that attached to a B-29 for experiments. And again, the bomber would have its own fighter escort. This idea was extrapolated to the B-36 with the Republic F-84, and this was called the FICON, Fighter Conveyor. In World War II, a Tupolev TB-3 carried two Polikarpov I-16s, same concept. Oh, these were used as bombers that could extend the range of the mothership and go out and operate tactically. Well, if it looks right, it flies right. But here we have the French Leduc 021 at top and the 022 at bottom. These were ramjet powered experimental aircraft. The 022 achieved a speed of Mach 1.15 in 1956. But the endurance of these airplanes, and again, these were experimental, was merely 15 to 20 minutes after launching from the mothership. Another concept was carrying airplanes on the wingtips of the larger motherships. Here we have a Douglas C-47 carrying a Culver Cadet. And again, into the jet age with Republic F-84 Thunderjets attached to the wingtips of a B-29. Tragically, all three airplanes were lost with all the crew members in experiments that determined that this was not a successful way to bring fighters with the bombers. How about this? An asymmetric aircraft in World War II, the Blohm & Voss BV-141. In Great Britain, the Armstrong Whitworth AW-52 was a 1947 jet designed to study laminar flow for flying wings. It was powered by two Rolls-Royce Nene engines. And although it flew successfully in 1947, ultimately it was lost in an accident. And again, you build it, you try it, you see what works, you keep the best. It was a very aesthetically beautiful airplane, but another step in the aerial oddity. Speaking of flying wings, of course, we had the Northrop XB-35 and the YB-35 versions, and those were converted to the YB-49 jet flying wings. Unsuccessful in their own right at that time. They were just too advanced for the era. They needed a digital flight control system, stability augmentation systems, and that wound up as the B-2 in the 1990s. Aerial oddities in sailplanes? Well, sort of. This is a LET Blahnik L-13 in U.S. Air Force Vietnam camo. Good trick. But here's the L-13. It was a very successful sailplane. More than 2,500 were built, first flown in 1956. But the idea was, how could this be converted to a motor glider? Well, you get two R-4360s. No, this was a photo of a Blahnik parked underneath a Boeing C-97 that was cobbled into the cover of Motor Gliding magazine back in the 1970s. But let's take a page out of history. If you look at the twin fuselage North American F-82 twin Mustang, and even though it was called Twin Mustang, it wasn't two P-51s. This was a totally different airplane. But the idea was to take two similar fuselages and attach them on a wing. And let's see what would happen if we did that with the Blahnik. We get the LET Ganesh AS-1 twin Blahnik. Charlie Ganesh was one of the owners of Aerosport, the distributor for the Blahnik, and he and I came up with this concept in the mid-1970s. And with a pusher prop, it was a really aesthetically beautiful airplane. Jet airliners. Now, this is a push. Take the DC-10 and make it a twin. That's an aerial oddity. But this concept was studied and developed. You had models. It was even carried over into the 1980s, where they were considering a twin-engine DC-10 fuselage with giant winglets. That didn't work. How about an ultimate stretch with giant winglets? Well, this eventually emerged as the MD-11, and it was not as elaborate a modification, but an aerial oddity for the DC-10 airliner for sure. Now let's look at the quest for military airlift. What were they trying to do? They wanted greater speed, range, payload, overall capacity, improved logistics, and easier loading and offloading. How would they achieve that? You want to see some aerial oddities? You're not going to believe this. Now we start with the C-47. tried and true, great transport airplane from World War II. What would happen if we could make this a waterborne aircraft? That's right, the XC-47C on giant Edo floats. But wait, there's more. This wasn't just a seaplane, it was an amphibian. It had landing gear and could land on either runways or water. Here we have the Chase XCG-18 Avitruck. Where are the engines? Well, it's a glider. Okay. You put prop engines on it, you make it a jet. You wind up ultimately with the Fairchild C-123K. The fuselage of the Avitruck wound up as the Hiller X-18 swing wing VTOL test aircraft. Would you believe a tail dragger tri-motor air rescue aircraft? Yep, you're looking at the Northrop YC-125 Raider, which coincidentally is the same name as Northrop's new B-21 stealth bomber. Go figure. 23 of these YC-125s were built. And the old adage, if it looks right, it flies right. How about this one, the Fairchild XC-120 pack plane, where the cargo pod would detach from the upper airframe. The giant XC-99, which was a cargo version of the Convair B-36. You look at the complexity of the cockpit at upper right. And here we have the Douglas C-124 Globemaster II swallowing a Douglas World Cruiser that had been restored at Santa Monica. This was the airplane that was delivered to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. But take the overall airlifter concept to the ultimate for the United States Air Force with the C-5 Galaxy. This is an airplane that had an 840,000-pound max takeoff gross weight. And where I'm going with this is, what if we took a C-5, took the engines off and made it into a giant cargo glider towed by a 6-engine airlifter that was even bigger? Not quite sure why, but this is an illustration I did for Douglas in the early 1980s. And the idea was that they'd take these cargo gliders all over the world and tow them to their destinations. Now, the idea is with a tow plane, you are towing the glider and then the tow plane releases and the glider is on its own. As you see here, not quite sure how this would have worked. But Douglas had a turboprop airlifter, the C-133 Cargo Master. And if you extrapolate that to a 6-engine version, you wind up with this. This is a cargo airlifter that was one of a series of studies that we did here at Long Beach in the early 1980s. This is an illustration by our staff illustrator, Steve Wright. And it's a 6-engine turboprop swept wing cargo aircraft with a swing up nose. But wait, how about a cargo Zeppelin? Now, am I seeing this correctly? It's an 8-engine airship with cargo carried externally on a pallet hanging below the 8-engine airship. Right. How about a span loader? This is where the cargo is carried in the wings. This is a military 4-engine span loader with twin T-tails. And you take a closer look, you have cargo being loaded in on a dock. Look at the nose of the airplane and those tiny little figures. We did that on purpose to make the airplanes look larger. The other wingtip, you've got a ramp with trucks coming down. And it just showed the versatility of an airplane like this, even though it was never built. Here's a civilian cargo version, and we did this composition to show the complexity of the 747 type cargo airplane, even though that's highly exaggerated. And then the simplicity by comparison of the span loader, where the cargo goes into the ends of the wings. Here's a closer look. 6 engines, CF6. I apologize. I'm sorry. We get to the C-15 program. This is the YC-15, actually. This was a prototype aircraft that became a cargo predecessor for the C-17 Globemaster III. But believe it or not, the YC-15 was considered as a missile launcher. Here we have an MX Peacekeeper missile being jettisoned out of the cargo bay. And the idea was that the carrier would eventually drop into the vertical and the missile would ignite and head off to its target. This looks like a radical concept. Believe it or not, it was done several times. In 1974, a partially fueled Minuteman was launched from a C-5. And here we have a C-17 dropping what was called the quick reach rocket. Even though the rocket wasn't fired, it demonstrated that air launches were feasible from a C-17. And then we have the other category. The Northrop B-2 stealth bomber, which flew in the early 1990s. But 10 years earlier, McDonnell Douglas had proposed an ATB, which was the Advanced Tactical Bomber, a 4-seat aircraft seen here. Again, never reached even mock-up stage. And these are really design studies. I can't call them programs or operational aircraft. These were design studies to see if something like this would even be feasible. And the ultimate aerial oddity, the Caspian Sea Monster in Strategic Air Command Service, again, a McDonnell Douglas study. That's the original Russian version at top and the Douglas version at bottom. Well, as you can see, aerial oddities come in all shapes and sizes, but sometimes they make history. And there you have it, a look at aerial oddities over the years. Thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, take care.